Welcome to the Ruthless Criticism Podcast. Today is Thursday, May 17th, 2018. That means tomorrow is Labor Day. What the hell am I talking about? Every Friday is Labor Day because the weekend was a product of the labor struggles in our country historically and around the world historically. So Friday is Labor Day. Remember that for the future. Labor Day every week, folks. Today, I thought I would do something a little bit different rather than address some questions or comments from the Capitalism v. Socialism subreddit. I would take a look at the Socialism 101 subreddit. Originally, I was going to look at the Marxism 101 subreddit, but I've been banned from that, I think. So we're going to use the Socialism 101 subreddit. And I want to point out that I'm not going to answer just any question. And I'm not going to look at the existing responses. I'm just going to look through the list of topics, see what questions are there. If a question looks interesting, then I'll answer it. Otherwise, I will probably just exclude it. And there's a few that I'm going to exclude just by the nature of the type of question. I don't want to get into things like can you point me at this resource, or can you give a suggestion for this, or something of that nature. So it's just going to be the questions that sort of relate to, what the people are asking with respect to socialism or a socialist society. So let's go ahead and read some of those, and we'll see how this goes. I'm not too hopeful because some of these are longer, and I don't want to pause too much during this and take time to read the question, only to find out it's stupid. So if I read a stupid one, maybe I'll just say, okay, I think that's stupid, and move on. First question: if someone's passionate about socialism and is a great and smart public speaker, would they be able to make any sort of change? Answer is yes. How can international revolution successfully happen? Oh, geez, that's a big one. It's going to require the international proletariat to rise up in opposition to capitalism, clearly. I think given modern communication, this is something that is going to be much more of a possibility now than it has ever been. And, we've seen across this communication just how different movements across different areas have been beginning to connect to one another. And we're starting to see a real waning, I think, in terms of nationalism. Even nationalistic struggles now have begun to take on a new form, particularly Israel-Palestine in the last 5 years, I would say, compared to historically. I mean, the shift from this idea of Palestine as a nation and the focus on a two-state solution versus today, where it is much more an argument about human rights struggles. And I think there was, I think there's a conscious political effort there. It's not to say that there's not still nationalist bourgeois forces within that region that are trying to essentially establish a new nation for their own ends and their own particular interests within their class. But I think it's definitely changing, and I think the internet and modern communication has a lot to do with that. Is it okay to be a general socialist / anti-capitalist / anti-fascist? Socialism has no generals. No, but yeah, of course, it's okay to be whatever you want, I guess, unless you're a fascist, then that's not okay. But an anti-fascist, yes. Just, politically, I think, people look for these labels and they want to identify as like some sort of very peculiar or obscure ideology or something like that. And I just don't think it's particularly useful. I don't think that's how anyone should examine politics. I don't think that's particularly useful. It may be useful to identify as something for purposes of easily conveying a sort of general attitude or a sense that you have. So if you say, okay, well, I'm an anarchist, people can get at least a sense for what your proclivities are in terms of your positions. If you say, okay, I'm a left communist, then people can get a sense there. If you say I'm a Leninist, people get a sense. If I'm a Marxist-Leninist or a Stalinist, people get a different sense. So I think it's useful in that sphere of things, but that's still only going to be primarily useful to the left. Identifying as a socialist or a communist, even to people who aren't within the left, that might give the opposite effect of what you have. It might actually solidify an understanding of your positions that is not your actual understanding. So be wise with political labels and use them where appropriate, but don't think that you need to particularly choose one label or another. Next question, is socialism still a viable ideology in the information age? Socialism is not an ideology. As for whether or not socialism itself is viable or communism itself is viable, of course, as I just got done saying on the issue of different struggles now happening sort of internationally and how they seem to have changed with the growth of the internet and how those struggles seem to be sort of redirecting more towards general internationalized struggles for things like human rights. The information age has been extremely important in that aspect. And I'm reminded of the old quote that the capitalists will sell us the rope that we hang them with, which is much more interesting when looked at from a standpoint of how capitalism drives technology and drives development of these markets and drives development of trying to sell these different products. And in doing so, creates not only just the basic material conditions in terms of what makes socialism or communism a viable organization for society, but which actually gives rise to a lot of the capacity and the movements and opportunity for change. Okay, next question. Should entrepreneurs be compensated more? No. Abolish wages, abolish money, no compensation. Sorry. What is human nature according to socialists? For lack of getting into too much detail, I would say it is largely a blank slate. I think a lot of this originated with Marxian concept of species essence. Basically, though, the idea is that the social structures in society have a heavy influence on what our nature tends to be. That's not to say that biological or evolutionary or genetic factors even don't play a role. It is to say, though, however, that the systems that we create are as much a real material force in the development of us as anything else. So it's not something that is transhistoric or universal. And even from a biological standpoint and an evolutionary standpoint, because we are reacting to material conditions and to our environment, that can, of course, change in other ways, even at a much more foundational level. What's wrong with utopianism? Well, that depends on what you mean by utopianism. Utopianism is very often used in modern English to refer to essentially a perfect society or a belief in a perfect society, whereas Marx didn't really use it this way. In a sense, he used it this way, but in a sense not. So what Marx meant by utopianism was essentially an idealization. So it was a concept of idealizing society, and even then I run the risk of basically sounding like I'm saying the same thing. But the key aspect of this is that when you delve into utopianism, which can be practically described as the desire to try and sort of preconceive of all these very specific things about how society will work or how society will function with different social relations, or worse, prescribe those types of functions and mechanisms in society, then what you're really doing is you are taking out, you're taking society out of its real material conditions and the things that actually shape it, and you are creating it into an idea, and you're saying essentially that society develops through ideas. That is, that it's this concept that history is written by people with great ideas, and people with great ideas convince more people that their ideas are great, and then everyone gets together and has this huge party, and people go, oh yeah, well, let's make these ideas the actual way that society works because that's great. And that's simply not how history works. What are your thoughts on socialist orgs selling papers at rallies? In one sense, I'm thankful. I read the militant. I used to organize with the SWP, and I read the militant for probably a good 2 years. And while I wasn't one of the people that was trying to sell it, I was often hanging around the people trying to sell it, and I subscribed, and I also got a bunch of free copies and back copies and things like that. And as far as being just taking it as a newspaper, it, like any other newspaper, it's going to have certain commentary that obviously comes from their particular biases in terms of how they perceive things and how they see the future and want to push the future. But just from a standpoint of a newspaper, I'm actually quite grateful that a paper like The Militant, for example, still exists. And looking at it historically, I mean, just the history there and the documenting of the worker struggle, I think is very important. So I'm extremely grateful in that sense. In another sense, I think it so dominates, particularly the Trotskyist strain, but it so dominates it that it becomes essentially just a mechanism for keeping the organization alive when the organization doesn't have anything else. And at that point, it's like, why don't you just convert and say, okay, we're no longer a political party. We are now a newspaper organization or a media organization. And you'd probably actually do much better. You'd probably get much more volunteers. You know, you can still have a political bias. It doesn't mean that you have to abandon having any positions or trying to forward any particular positions. Obviously, if you're a newspaper covering workers' issues from a worker's perspective, you're going to have that bias anyway, and you're going to have certain positions that formulate out of that. But I would think an organization like the SWP would fare far better just to be kept up as an organization, to be much more widely accepted, and both in terms of financially being able to sustain itself, but also in terms of just membership. You know, there's no shame in my mind of being that media organization. And the workers' movement needs it. It needs it desperately, especially in this time of media consolidation. That's not to say that, newspaper is not a extremely viable mechanism these days. Although I actually think in some ways newspapers are better for spreading the word at something like a rally than is having a Twitter or a Facebook or even a YouTube channel. So you can hand out cards all day long with this information and go and say, oh, check out my articles on my blog or check out my videos on YouTube. And the problem is that most people put that in their pocket, then they go home and they either toss it in the trash or it goes into a pile and they never look at it again. Newspapers, I'm actually far more likely, not so much flyers, the same thing that happens with business cards I'll have on flyers, but newspapers, I'm much more likely to take home. And even if I set it on my desk or if I set it on my bookshelf, I will pick that up at some point and read from it, just because it has more substance and can provide me with something to pass the time if I get bored or additional reading material. This is especially good for people who are commuters. If you're taking a bus or a local commuter rail or something like that, newspapers are great for that sort of thing. You can read just as many articles as you sort of have to fit in time. It doesn't feel like you have to carry around this like huge thing. You can sort of roll it up or fold it up and put it wherever you need to put it. And, it's a great medium in that sense. And I think it would actually fare pretty well for that type of distribution. I think what people get wary of is just, the organization that's coming from and what is it they're trying to push aside from just selling a subscription. But be more upfront about it and be more of that, we're a media organization, we need support. And I think it would do wonders. I think it would be great. Thoughts on post-leftism. I just think that this whole notion of post-leftism, third wayism, whatever these people are talking about, even on the sort of left communist side and the sort of orthodox Marxist side, you get this idea, it's not left. And it's like, just, recognize that most people are using the terms left and right with something in mind. They're not thinking of it on a spectrum of capitalism necessarily. They're not necessarily limiting to that. I don't think there's any reason why communists or socialists should not say, okay, we're on the left, right? I mean, historically, this is how it's been identified. And, maybe not when you go way back in history and left and right meant something very specific within, the wings of bourgeois government. But for essentially the last 100 plus years, left and right has been an obvious sort of dichotomy and something which people are generally familiar with. So I have no problem saying that I'm on the left. And I think anyone who does and needs or feels the need to identify with post-leftism is sort of insane. Now, as far as the actual positions that go along with it, for the most part, I've heard pretty positive positions from people who might say they're post-left. I've also heard some pretty crazy positions, downright reactionary positions. To me, it just seems like a term that is so broad and so ill-conceived that it can essentially cover anything, all the way from people that I would consider straight up Marxists to complete fascists. Are there non-anarchist forms of syndicalism? Historically or academically, I'm going to say I have no idea. From a sort of philosophical perspective, or just how I would think of it logically, I would say no, only because to me, the position of syndicalism is essentially that the syndicate essentially becomes the sort of political force or the political power within the overall social structure. That is to say, the idea is that you're going to have this sort of worker syndicate, which is essentially the working class organized as a political power. And if that's not the definition of a state in Marxist terms, at least, then I don't know what is. So it seems to me that what is really happening is that syndicalism is used to posit the same sort of political force as a dictatorship of the proletariat, but it is reserved sort of for, or as part of the anarchist vernacular, simply for the sake of not wanting to admit to a state apparatus. What is the best solution for the crisis in Venezuela from a socialist perspective? Well, the answer to that, of course, is socialism or communism. But as with anywhere else, workers should be organizing politically and trying to organize as a class politically in order to wrest power from the current bourgeois government and in order to be able to resist influence from external bourgeois forces. How does society function in terms of innovation and creative design? I don't even understand the relevance of that question, so we're going to skip that. How would you describe the basic principles of democratic socialism? Who cares? I'm no history major. No, that's not a question. How exactly is the Lassallean iron law of wages disproven by Marx, and is it antithetical to scientific socialism? I'm actually going to address this from a more modern standpoint. I'll distinguish it from Marx's concept of wages in that Marx was pretty careful. I can't think of an example where he deviated from this, but basically, whenever Marx described wages, he would always talk about the reproduction of a worker as a worker. So he would not talk about the reproduction of a worker as a sort of biological being. And the distinct difference here is that the worker as a worker will have particular demands. And this is something that, the worker does have at least that little inkling of individual sort of power to control this aspect of their lives, in that, it is possible for them to refuse to work. So there's a few aspects to this. One is the fact that capitalism does so heavily advance the means of production and therefore the conditions in which we find ourselves, that for workers to demand basic subsistence throughout this entire eternity while productive forces just keep on rising would be quite absurd. So the overall subsistence level, or the overall minimum level which workers are demanding, is going to increase with general productivity increases. There's other aspects that are much more technical with respect to rate of surplus versus rate of profit. But generally speaking, workers never have been willing to work for mere subsistence alone. That is to say that we're not constrained by the sort of biological aspects, but we're constrained by the larger sort of social level of subsistence. This is why a modern phrase like living wage does not refer to simply what it is required to stay alive, absolutely. So it's not just your basic necessities. It's the idea that people deserve a wage that gives them some semblance of dignity, and what that dignity looks like is going to depend on the larger productive capacity of society, how technology has advanced, what the current wealth distribution looks like, and probably historically how that relates to other periods of different wealth distributions. Next question. State capitalism. What is it, and why doesn't this describe the USSR? Other socialism subs can't seem to agree on this. I may have actually answered this in the thread. And no, maybe I didn't. Okay, so the basic principle behind state socialism is essentially that the state fulfills the role of the capitalist in those societies. And this also means that the state will generally interface to other nations very much like a capitalist enterprise or a capitalist firm. So that is to say, you would still have things like exports and imports, and you would still have a drive by the state to, say, increase exports in order to increase its realization of surplus value in the larger global economy. And this is a principle that really can only establish itself within the international relations under capitalism because of the way that capitalism has developed into a global system. Historic systems did not have the interconnections that modern capitalism has. That is to say that, yes, we did go to different parts of the world and different nations did explore different parts of the world or set up certain trade routes with the world. But by and large, a single nation was essentially self-sufficient or self-contained. There wasn't this reliance on the other nations within the larger sort of system. And to the extent that those relations became required was also to the extent that capitalism grew, because these essentially became required through exchange relations, through trade relations. So state socialism basically is a condition where the essential relations of capitalism have not been done away with. And instead of the capitalist class as a whole, the state takes on the role of that the capitalist class within that country. That's not to say that they take on the role of the capitalist class at an international scale. That's obviously not the case. But they do continue the reproduction and expansion of capital, which obviously requires the production of surplus value, which in turn requires the exploitation of labor, which in turn will result in some semblance of wage labor. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be wage labor directly in the sense that we think about it. Keep in mind from the previous answer that when we talk about wages, we are talking about the allocation of value towards the reproduction of the workers as workers. And that includes the reproduction of the working class as a whole. So that includes child rearing and the ability to bring up the next generation of workers. And it doesn't matter if this wage return comes in the form necessarily of individual or collective negotiation. That is to say, you could have essentially the workers interfacing with a state to negotiate their returns with respect to what would be viewed today as social services. In this sense, a lot of what are often called socialist countries in Europe are actually much more state capitalist countries than anything else. Now, this isn't to say that they're completely state capitalists. They're still overwhelmingly private capitalists, but they do have certain state capitalist aspects to them or state capitalist functions. There was a recognition in the early Bolshevik days, just after the revolution and going up into the NEP, that was basically an admission of the state capitalist function of the Russian state. And this was actually a fairly conscious endeavor to essentially develop capitalism materially, or to try and match the material development of capitalism, because of the particular conditions that Russia found itself in prior to its proletarian revolution. And to be clear, that revolution was a proletarian revolution. It's just that it devolved extremely rapidly. So I would actually argue that by 1918, essentially all semblances of proletarian control were abolished. And this came predominantly through the development of what was called the trust. And the trusts were essentially factory committees, so to speak, but they were not comprised of workers, or if they were comprised of workers, they weren't sort of directed by workers. The trusts acted as economic units that were essentially led by the nascent national bourgeoisie of Russia at the time. And it was a way to try and concede that some level of technical work in terms of accounting, in terms of economic development, etc., would have to be handled by this class, which had essentially the most experience through industrial development in Russia for what little industrial development it had. And this was what became the essential opposition to the Soviets themselves. By, I think, probably 1919, you had the workers' opposition begin forming, and the trade unions that were essentially arising in response to this. And what you ended up with essentially was Lenin at the leadership of the party arguing directly against what might constitute the only semblance of socialism that Russia was even capable of having at the time. That is to say that the workers' opposition and other workers' factions rose up to try and establish some political force among the working class. And by 1921, I believe, it was the 9th or 10th Congress. I believe it was during one of those ones that you had the official banning of factions within the Communist Party. This banning was a direct response to the development of the workers' opposition. From there, you also get the immediate adoption, essentially, of the NEP. That's in the 10th Congress, and by 1922, you then have monetary reform and foreign concessions, which amounts to foreign capital investment or foreign enterprises within the Soviet Union. And this was so much recognized internally that by the time Stalin comes to power, he is talking about a leftward turn. He's talking about building socialism again, and eventually declares that socialism has been achieved, as if it just took the juridical actions of a strong man to declare it, and so it would be. And of course, there were many policy reforms that had changed between these developments post 1917 up until the 30s. With even the concessions themselves disappearing. But what this amounts to is a takeover of those bourgeois functions by the state. So it's sort of the final realization of state capitalism as opposed to an overturning of it. That is to say, okay, we've used what we can from the non-national bourgeois forces, or even the national bourgeois forces that we had within Russia at the time. And now we're essentially going to replace all that has now sort of built up the development of capitalism in Russia with the state, and the state will take on this role, and then we can essentially kick all the capitalists out and go along from there. So that's about as brief a summary as I can offer. The short answer then is that yes, the USSR was state capitalist. There's no other way to describe it when you actually look at the historic development of it and the inevitable policies that came out of that development, or the general state and condition of the working class within Russia. And that's going to conclude my thoughts on that, as well as the podcast as a whole. I hope people enjoyed this. It was a little bit fast-paced compared to some of my other stuff, but I'm hoping that the diversity of the topics will maybe spring up some more discussion in the comments. Although I have a limited number of subscribers, I do know that the videos are at least getting views, and I'm a little bit sad to see that there's not more commenting and discussion. So, as always, if you like this podcast or you found it insightful in any way, please leave a comment, thumbs up, and make sure that you subscribe.